In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and meandering roads, lived a 91-year-old war veteran. His name was known to a few, but not many. He wasn't a man who sought attention or admiration. Instead, he found peace in the simplicity of his life. The soft rustle of the leaves outside his window, the warmth of a well-loved chair by the fireplace, and the aroma of his morning coffee were his little joys. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Years had passed since his time in the service. The memories of battlefields, the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, and the scars, both visible and hidden, had faded into the background. Now the aches of old age were his constant companions. His joints creaked with every step, and his sight was not as sharp as it used to be, but his mind remained as clear as ever. He could still recall the faces of those who had served alongside him, the hardships they had faced, and the bonds that had been formed under the most unimaginable circumstances. Though time had moved on, he hadn't forgotten. Every day he took the same walk around the block, a quiet ritual that gave him a sense of purpose. The neighborhood was familiar, the people were kind, and life moved at a gentle pace. He would wave at his neighbors, most of whom were younger families with children, and smile as the kids rode their bikes or played in their yards. They would wave back, a little hesitant at first, unsure whether to speak to the elderly man who seemed so out of place in their modern world. But the veteran always smiled and nodded, and over the years some of them had come to know him. He wasn't just the old man down the street, he was a piece of living history. Though his body had aged, his mind still carried the weight of stories of a different time, of a world that no longer existed. Some people found it hard to believe that the frail old man with silver hair and glasses had once been a soldier, a young man who had fought in wars and had experienced things most people couldn't even imagine. The children in the neighborhood sometimes asked him questions, their curiosity piqued by his presence, but he never spoke of the past unless asked. And when he did, his stories were always measured, as if he were carefully choosing which memories to share. But even as he settled into his daily routine, the world around him was changing. The town, once sleepy and predictable, had started to feel different. Over the past few months, a new group of people had begun to make their presence known. Loud, brash, and filled with an energy that seemed to disturb the calm rhythm of life he had come to cherish. They were bikers, a group of men and women who had settled in town and who often gathered at the local diner or roamed the streets on their motorcycles. At first, the veteran had paid little attention to them. After all, he had seen all kinds of people during his life, and not much surprised him anymore. But it was impossible to ignore the sounds of their engines revving at all hours of the day, the way they rode through the streets without a care, their laughter loud and unrestrained. Some of the bikers were young, barely out of their teens, while others were older, their faces weathered and rough. They seemed to take pride in their defiance of convention, in their ability to ruffle feathers and draw attention wherever they went. The veteran had never been one to judge others by their appearance, but there was something about the way they carried themselves that unsettled him. It wasn't just their noise. It was the way they seemed to disregard the quiet dignity that had once defined the town. Days turned into weeks, and soon the veteran found himself noticing their presence more and more. He saw them gathering at the diner, their loud voices cutting through the air as they shared stories and jokes. At first, they didn't pay much attention to him, but over time, something began to change. It wasn't just the bikers' noise that grew louder, it was their attitude. They began to notice him, too. The veteran was used to being left alone, to walking down the street without being disturbed. But now it seemed as if the bikers were watching him, their eyes following his every move. He would feel their gaze on him as he made his way down the sidewalk, and on more than one occasion he heard them whispering, laughing under their breath. It wasn't long before the first taunt came. One afternoon, as he made his way to the small park near his home, one of the bikers called out to him, a sharp, mocking tone in his voice. "Hey, old man, where's your bike?" He sneered, his friends laughing along with him. The veteran kept walking, his head held high, pretending not to hear, but inside a knot twisted in his stomach. He wasn't bothered by the insult itself. It was the fact that he had never done anything to provoke them. The teasing continued. At first it was just words, little jabs here and there. But as the days passed, the bikers became bolder. One evening, as the veteran sat on his porch enjoying the last of the daylight, A group of them passed by, laughing and shouting. One of them threw something, just a small object, at his house, striking the window with a dull thud. The veteran didn't flinch, but inside something shifted. He knew he was no longer just a silent observer in this small town. He was now a target. What hurt most wasn't the objects thrown at his house or the taunts from the bikers. It was the sense of helplessness that crept in. For the first time in his life, the veteran felt afraid. Afraid of the people who had invaded his town, his quiet life. Afraid of what might happen next. But he wasn't the kind of man who would easily admit fear. He was a soldier, a man who had seen the worst of the world and had come through it. He had faced battles, had seen friends fall, had endured hardships beyond what most could even imagine. He had always prided himself on his strength, on his ability to endure. But these bikers, these bullies, were different. They were relentless, and for the first time the veteran wasn't sure how to fight back. And so he kept walking. He kept his head high even as his heart felt heavy. He had fought in wars, but now he faced a different kind of battle, one that seemed harder to win. The veteran had never expected his peaceful town to change so quickly. When the bikers first rolled into town, they seemed like an isolated group, outsiders passing through, making noise, but eventually moving on. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, they seemed to take up residence, making the town their own. Their presence grew from a background nuisance to something more insistent, something unavoidable. It was like the world he had once known was slowly slipping away, and with it, the quiet life he had built for himself. The harassment, though subtle at first, began to escalate. The veteran had always been a private man, someone who preferred the comfort of his own space. Now it felt as if every time he stepped outside he was being watched, judged, ridiculed. It wasn't just the insults anymore, or the objects thrown at his house. The bikers started to take their antics to another level. One afternoon, as he was watering his garden, he noticed a group of them gathered just across the street, standing around their bikes, talking loudly. He could hear their voices over the soft hum of the neighborhood, the familiar chatter replaced by their disruptive energy. He tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the task at hand, but it was impossible not to notice how they were looking in his direction. He could feel their eyes on him, even from a distance. "Look at that old guy," one of them called out. The veteran didn't turn around, though he could tell by the voice that the comment was aimed at him. Probably thinks he's still in the army or something. The laughter that followed made his heart sink. He wasn't bothered by the words themselves, but by the cruelty behind them. These weren't just harmless jokes. They were meant to mock him, to belittle him. And it wasn't just one or two people. It was the whole group, making him the target of their attention. The veteran felt the sting of humiliation, but he refused to let it show. As days passed, the situation only got worse. The bikers began to encroach more into his space. They would ride up and down the street, revving their engines at all hours of the day. The noise was deafening, breaking the stillness that had once defined the veteran's life. He couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, it followed him, like a shadow that wouldn't let him be. One day, as he walked down the sidewalk, one of the bikers, a man with a thick beard and a weathered face, rode by him slowly. The engine of the motorcycle roared, and the veteran instinctively stepped to the side, trying to make room for the biker. But as the man passed by, he leaned over and shouted something that made the veteran's blood run cold. "Old man, get out of the way. This is our town now." The words were harsh, and they hit harder than any of the physical insults he had endured. The veteran stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. For a moment he stood frozen, staring at the biker's back as he rode away. He had heard enough. This wasn't just about noise or childish teasing anymore. It was about control, about asserting dominance over someone who seemed too weak, too old, to fight back. It wasn't the first time the bikers had made their claim on the town, but it was the first time it felt so personal. The veteran had spent most of his life fighting for something bigger than himself. He had fought for his country, for his comrades, for values that ran deeper than the day-to-day squabbles of the people in his town. Now, as an old man, it seemed that fight had come to his doorstep in a way he never imagined. That evening, as he sat in his living room, the weight of the day's events settled on him. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a prison. He could hear the distant rumble of the bikers' motorcycles in the background, even though the sun had long since set. The noise never stopped. He tried to focus on something else, perhaps a book or the flickering television, But nothing could quiet the thoughts in his mind. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to take care of himself. But now he wasn't sure if he could continue to ignore the problem. The more he tried to push it aside, the more it seemed to consume him. It wasn't just about being bullied, it was about his dignity, about the life he had built and the peace he had fought for. The veteran had lived through wars and battles, seen friends fall in ways that still haunted him. But this, the constant harassment from a group of strangers, was a kind of battle he didn't know how to fight. He wasn't a young man anymore. His strength had faded over the years, and his body was no longer the instrument of power it had once been. But that didn't mean he was ready to give up. He began to make small changes to his routine, walking at different times of the day, avoiding the places where the bikers hung out. But no matter how hard he tried, it was impossible to escape them. They had taken over the town, turning it into a place he no longer recognized. The veteran, who had once walked these streets with pride, now found himself shrinking into the shadows, trying to avoid conflict, trying to avoid the bikers. It wasn't just the fear of confrontation that kept him from standing up to them. It was the feeling of helplessness, of being a man who no longer commanded the respect he once had. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't the young man who had faced danger with courage and strength. He was just an old man, and the bikers knew it. The veteran thought about calling the police, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He had seen too many things in his life to believe that calling for help would solve anything. The law might be able to stop the bikers from breaking the law, but it couldn't restore the pride and respect they had stolen from him. It couldn't give him back the quiet life he had known. As the days wore on, the veteran began to retreat more into himself. He stopped going to the local diner where he used to chat with friends, stopped taking walks around the neighborhood. He didn't want to face the bikers again. He didn't want to deal with the sneers, the taunts, the looks of disdain. It was easier to stay home, to pretend that everything was fine. But deep down, he knew that was not the answer. The harassment continued, and the veteran found himself asking questions he never thought he'd ask. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to defend himself against these bullies, these strangers who seemed to have no regard for him or his life? He had fought in wars, faced enemies who wanted to take everything from him, but none of that prepared him for the cruel mockery of a group of young men who had no understanding of the struggles he had endured. It wasn't until one evening, as he sat alone in his home, that he realized something. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let the bikers take everything from him, even if they didn't know what they were taking. He had fought too hard in his life to let a group of strangers strip him of his dignity. The veteran knew it was time to do something. But what? The veteran sat in his armchair late one evening, staring out of the window into the darkened street. The quiet that surrounded him felt almost unnatural. The bikers, who had once filled the air with the roar of their engines, had finally gone home for the night. But the stillness was unsettling, and his mind wouldn't let him rest. The feeling of being hunted, of being a target, had taken hold of him. He felt the weight of the days pressing down on his chest, and the loneliness he'd once accepted seemed unbearable now. There was something about the way the bikers had treated him that made him feel small, insignificant. It wasn't the words they said or the taunts they hurled. It was the sense that they had no respect for him. It wasn't even that they disrespected his age. It was that they didn't understand him. They didn't know what it had taken to survive, what it had cost him. They didn't know the sacrifices he had made or the things he had seen. But in their eyes, he was just another old man, someone who didn't matter. The veteran had lived a full life, one filled with both pride and pain. He had once been a strong young man, standing shoulder to shoulder with comrades in arms. Together, they had fought for a cause they believed in. They had shared everything, victories and losses alike. But now, alone in his quiet home, the veteran realized how much those days had shaped him. They had given him a strength that wasn't physical, but emotional. A strength to endure, to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. He had never been one to shy away from a fight. Whether it was on the battlefield or in his personal life, he had always believed in standing up for himself, for the people he loved, and for the things he held dear. But now, as an old man, he found himself questioning whether he still had that strength. These bikers, these strangers, had forced him into a corner, and he didn't know how to get out. But one thing was clear. He couldn't just let this continue. He couldn't keep hiding in his house, avoiding the problem. He had to do something. even if he didn't know what that something was. And so, with a deep breath, he reached for the phone that sat on the small table beside his chair. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, his finger hovering over the numbers. There was one person he could turn to, one person who might understand. A fellow soldier, a man who had been his comrade in arms during their younger days. They had shared stories and struggles, had fought side by side, and had survived together. But over the years they had lost touch. Life had pulled them in different directions, and the veteran hadn't spoken to his old friend in many years. But now, as he looked at the phone in his hand, he knew what he had to do. His fingers moved steadily as he dialed the familiar number, the digits almost automatic, as though his muscle memory still remembered them. It rang once, twice, and then to his relief the line picked up. "Hello?" A familiar voice answered on the other end. For a moment, the veteran couldn't speak. He had been so sure of what he wanted to say, but now that the moment had arrived, the words caught in his throat. The voice on the other end, calm and warm, spoke again. "It's been a long time," his old friend said. "How have you been?" The veteran cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "I've been all right," he replied, his voice rough. "But I need your help. It's something I can't handle on my own." There was a pause, a brief silence that stretched longer than it should have. His friend, ever the listener, waited for him to continue. And so the veteran told him everything. The harassment from the bikers, how they had been tormenting him, how he felt like he was no longer welcome in his own home, in his own town. The words spilled out like a dam breaking, as though all the frustration and fear he had been holding on to for weeks finally had a chance to breathe. When he finished, there was another pause on the other end of the line. He waited, unsure of what his friend would say. Finally, his old comrade spoke. "You know, when we were out there together, fighting for our lives, we never backed down. We stood up for what was right, no matter the odds. And I can hear it in your voice, you haven't forgotten that." The veteran closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. He had spent so much time thinking he was too old, too weak to fight back. But his friend was right. He had survived things in his youth that most people couldn't even imagine. And here he was, still alive, still standing. "I'll be there soon," his friend said, pulling him from his thoughts. "I'll gather a few of the old crew. We'll come out and deal with this. You don't have to face this alone." The veteran's heart swelled with gratitude. He had always known that his comrades were more than just soldiers in arms. They were family. Even after all these years, they were still there for him, still willing to fight beside him when it mattered most. The conversation ended, and the veteran set the phone down slowly. He felt a sense of calm wash over him, but beneath that calm was something deeper, a fire. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of the old determination that had once defined him. He wasn't alone anymore. The next few days passed in a blur. The veteran kept to his routine as much as he could, trying to ignore the fear that had once gripped him so tightly. But now, each time he stepped outside, there was a different feeling in the air. He wasn't waiting for the bikers to attack him anymore. He was waiting for his friends to arrive. And then one morning they did. The veteran opened his door to find his old comrade standing there, just as he had promised. And behind him were a few familiar faces, men who had fought alongside the veteran in the past, men who understood the weight of sacrifice, who knew what it meant to stand up for something greater than yourself. They had all come, not just for the veteran, but for the town that had once been theirs. They were ready to take a stand, to show the bikers that they wouldn't be intimidated. The veteran felt his chest swell with pride. These were his brothers, his comrades, the ones who had stood by him when things were at their darkest. And now, together, they were going to take back the peace that had been stolen from him. As the group gathered outside, the veteran's heart beat steadily in his chest. He felt alive again, not just as a soldier, but as a man who still had something to fight for. The bikers didn't know it yet, but their days of terrorizing the town were coming to an end. And the veteran was no longer the target. He was the one standing strong, ready to face whatever came next. The morning was quiet, with a soft breeze flowing through the trees, but the veteran's heart beat faster than usual. He stood outside his house, surrounded by his old comrades. His friend, the one who had made the call to rally the others, stood beside him with a reassuring smile. The other men, too, seemed calm, as though this wasn't the first time they had stood together to face down something difficult. It wasn't. The veteran had fought in wars, faced danger and uncertainty, and survived things that most people couldn't begin to imagine. But today was different. Today he wasn't preparing for a battle in a foreign land away from the world he knew. Today he was preparing to fight for his home, for his peace, for his dignity. He had spent years in this small town, walking the same streets, sitting on his porch in the evenings, watching the seasons change. He had never expected things to get this way, to have strangers come in and disrupt his life, to feel like he was a target just because of his age and his history. It was a new kind of fight, and it wasn't one he knew how to handle at first, but now with his old friends by his side, he felt a sense of strength rising in him. They didn't come here just to intimidate. They came because they knew, as he did, that sometimes standing up wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being brave enough to show up. They stood together, waiting, knowing what they had to do. The bikers would be around soon. They were creatures of habit, always at the same spots, always loud, always proud of their presence. And the veteran knew deep down that it was time to end it. Not with violence, but with the kind of strength that comes from standing firm in your beliefs. The sound of motorcycles grew louder in the distance, and the veteran's comrades stood a little taller. The bikes appeared in the distance, roaring down the street toward the group. The veteran felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with something else, anticipation. He had faced down tougher things than this in his life, and now, as the bikers came closer, he realized that this wasn't just about him. This was about the entire town, about what it stood for, and about showing these bikers that they couldn't push people around just because they felt like it. The lead biker, the one who had mocked the veteran before, was the first to approach. He looked out over his shoulder at his group, and they all slowed down as they neared the veteran and his comrades. They had probably expected the same old story, the old man shaking in fear, trying to avoid conflict. They weren't expecting the group of men who stood in front of them, not backing down, not moving an inch. The lead biker stopped in front of the group, eyeing the veteran first, then looking at the others. He revved his engine, the sound shaking the air, but no one moved. It felt like time stood still for a moment, the noise of the bike echoing in the silence, and then the lead biker took off his helmet. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. The old man finally grow some courage? The veteran's friend stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "It's not about courage," he said. "It's about respect. You've crossed a line, and it's time someone reminded you what that means." The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. They were used to being feared, to having people cower before them. But here was a group of men, older than they were, perhaps but no less formidable, standing their ground, ready to take them on, not with fists, but with something far stronger: conviction. The veteran stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. "This town has been good to me. I've lived here in peace for a long time. I don't deserve to be treated this way, and neither do the people who live here. You may not understand that, but you will." For a moment, the lead biker just stared at him. There was no laughing, no mocking. It was as if the biker was seeing the veteran for the first time, really seeing him, not just as an old man, but as a person who had lived a life, who had fought for something. "I don't think you understand what you're messing with." "Old man," the biker finally said, his voice colder now, "we do what we want." The veteran didn't flinch. Not anymore. Not here. The silence that followed felt heavy, like something was about to break. But then one of the other bikers, a woman who had been quietly watching, spoke up. Her voice was less aggressive, more thoughtful. "Maybe we've been going about this all wrong," she said, glancing at the veteran and his group. "Maybe we've been loud but not loud enough to listen." The other bikers exchanged confused looks, unsure of what to make of her words. The veteran could feel a shift, something that wasn't just about him but about the others in the group. They weren't just trying to intimidate anymore. Something had clicked in their minds. Maybe it was respect, or maybe it was the realization that they weren't just invincible. They were human too. The leader of the group, the man who had mocked the veteran before, looked at his fellow bikers, his expression unreadable. For a moment it felt like the world had paused again, like everyone was waiting for the next move. Then, slowly, he turned his motorcycle off. He looked at the veteran and his friends. "I don't know what you've been through," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I'll tell you this. We don't want any trouble." There was a tense moment before the veteran spoke again. His voice was calm, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "Then leave. Go back to where you came from and let us live in peace." The bikers exchanged looks again, and one by one they mounted their bikes. The engines roared back to life, but this time it was different. There was no more taunting, no more threats. The bikers slowly drove away, each of them casting one last glance back at the group standing in the street. And as they disappeared down the road, the veteran felt a sense of calm wash over him. The fight wasn't won by fists, nor by threats. It was won by standing firm, by showing strength in the face of adversity, and by knowing that sometimes the loudest voice isn't the one that shouts the most, but the one that is calm and unwavering. The veteran turned to his friends, his comrades, his brothers. They didn't need to say anything. The look in their eyes said it all. They had done it. They had stood together and they had made their point. The town would be at peace again, and the veteran could finally breathe easier knowing that he had taken back the life he loved. As the sun began to set, the veteran felt a sense of pride rise within him. He wasn't just an old man. He was a soldier, a protector, and now he had shown everyone, including himself, that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The day after the bikers left, the veteran woke up with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from ignoring problems or pretending everything was fine. It was the kind of peace that came from standing up for yourself, for what you believed in, and knowing that the right thing had been done. As the sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across his small living room, the veteran sat in his favorite chair, his mind replaying the events of the previous day. He could still hear the roar of the bikers' engines, but now it felt like a distant memory. The town was quiet again, the way it had always been before the bikers came. And for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could finally breathe. He made his coffee as he did every morning and sat by the window, watching the world outside. It was a simple life, but it was his life, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for it. The neighborhood seemed different now, quieter, more peaceful. He could see the children playing in the yards, their laughter ringing out in the air, and he smiled to himself. He hadn't realized how much the bikers had disrupted his sense of calm until they were gone. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and the town had returned to the way it was meant to be. But even more than the quiet, the veteran felt a renewed sense of pride. He had fought for peace in his own way, not with weapons or violence, but with strength, courage, and the willingness to stand firm. It wasn't just about the bikers. It was about the town, about the people who lived there, and about the way the veteran had chosen to live his life. That afternoon, as the veteran sat on his porch, his neighbor, a younger man who had always waved to him but never spoken much, came over. The veteran looked up from his chair, surprised but pleased to see him. "Hey there," the neighbor said with a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to thank you." The veteran raised an eyebrow, unsure what the man meant. "I've been hearing what happened yesterday," the neighbor continued. "And I just wanted to say that what you did, it took courage. You stood up for yourself, for all of us. It's not something you see every day, not anymore." The veteran was quiet for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had never considered himself a hero. He wasn't looking for recognition. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had watched what happened from the sidelines, made him realize something important. Sometimes standing up wasn't just for you. It was for everyone around you. "Thanks," the veteran said softly. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. We all have to stand up when it matters." The neighbor nodded, still looking at the veteran with newfound respect. "I think you've reminded all of us of that, and I'm grateful for it." As the man walked away, the veteran sat back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had lived through so much, had seen so many things in his life. But it was moments like this, simple, quiet, unexpected, that made everything feel worthwhile. The days that followed were peaceful, but they were also different. The veteran walked the streets again, but now there was a new sense of confidence in his step. He wasn't just another old man in the neighborhood. He was someone who had shown that even in the face of fear and intimidation, it was possible to stand tall and demand respect. He didn't see the bikers again, not for a long time. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that they had learned a lesson, and so had the veteran. It wasn't about being the strongest or the toughest. It was about having the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like the odds were against you. He had done that, and it had made all the difference. One afternoon, while walking down the street, the veteran passed by the local diner, a place he used to visit regularly. He hadn't been there much lately, preferring the quiet of his home. But today, something tugged at him, and he decided to go in for a cup of coffee. As he entered the diner, the familiar bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned. The place was bustling with the usual crowd of locals, but something had changed. There was an air of respect in the room, a quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. The veteran made his way to the counter and took a seat, feeling the eyes of the room on him. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was different. The waitress, a woman who had served him countless cups of coffee over the years, smiled at him as she approached. "What can I get you today, sir?" she asked, her tone warm and friendly. He ordered his usual, and they exchanged a few pleasantries as she prepared his coffee. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like a small victory. The respect that had been shown to him wasn't just about what he had done with the bikers. It was about the way he had carried himself through the entire situation. He had done what was necessary, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. The veteran sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth of the drink fill him. As he looked around the diner, he saw the same people he had seen for years. Some of them waved to him, others nodded. It was as if the entire town had quietly acknowledged what he had done, and now there was a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. It was a small town, but it was his town, and for the first time in a long time it felt like home again. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the veteran returned to his porch. He sat in his chair, the cool breeze brushing against his face, and looked out at the peaceful neighborhood. The world outside seemed calmer, more settled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt content. The veteran's old comrades had gone back to their own lives, but they had left behind something important, a reminder that standing together, supporting each other, and having the courage to do what was right could make a real difference. The town had been shaken, but now it was healing, and so was the veteran. He had stood up not just for himself, but for the town he loved. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone that no matter how old you were, no matter how much time had passed, there was always a chance to make a difference. It wasn't about fighting for recognition or fame. It was about fighting for what was right, for the things that mattered. And in that quiet moment, as the stars began to shine in the sky above, the veteran felt proud of what he had done. The town was his again, and so was his peace.